Close your eyes for a moment, just for a moment, and take a breath. Not a performative breath, not the kind you take when someone tells you to breathe and you feel slightly annoyed. A real one. Slow, full, deliberate. Now ask yourself this question, and I mean really ask it, the way you would if someone you trusted sat across from you and wanted an honest answer. When was the last time your mind felt genuinely quiet, not asleep, not distracted, not scrolling through something until the silence felt too loud to bear, but actually quiet, calm, settled? The way a lake looks just before sunrise, when there is no wind and the surface holds everything in perfect stillness. For most people, that kind of mental quiet is not just rare. It is almost foreign, and that says something important. Not about weakness, not about failure, but about the nature of the world we inhabit and the habits of mind we have quietly accumulated over the years without ever choosing them deliberately. Here is what I want you to consider as we begin this journey together. Think about your home for a moment. Most people clean their homes regularly. They wash dishes, they vacuum floors, they wipe down surfaces, they take out the garbage, they donate old clothes they no longer wear, they organize drawers, they clear out refrigerators, they dust shelves. Without regular cleaning and decluttering, homes become chaotic, uninhabitable even, and everyone understands this. No one argues with the logic of keeping a physical space clean. But here is the thing. Most people spend almost no time cleaning their minds. The mind, just like your home, collects things. Over days, weeks, months, years. The mind collects worries that never resolve, resentments that never get expressed, comparisons that never satisfy, regrets that never stop replaying, fears that never get examined, grudges that never get released, doubts that never get answered, expectations that never get questioned, old versions of yourself that you keep trying to protect even when they no longer fit. Over time, this invisible accumulation creates something very specific, a kind of internal heaviness, a sense that no matter what you do, you are always carrying more than you should have to carry, that the day begins before you are ready, that there is never quite enough energy, never quite enough focus, never quite enough calm. And the strange thing, the thing that makes this so quietly devastating, is that most people attribute this heaviness to external circumstances. The job is too demanding, the relationship is too complicated, the world is too noisy, the schedule is too full. And while all of those things may be true to varying degrees, they are rarely the whole story, because the greatest source of exhaustion for most people is not what is happening outside of them. It is what is happening inside them. It is the mind that will not stop talking, the thoughts that loop back on themselves like a song stuck on repeat, the emotional residue of conversations from 3 days ago, the anxiety about things that have not happened yet and may never happen, the ongoing inner commentary that judges, doubts, compares, catastrophizes, and narrates everything, constantly, automatically, without being asked. This is mental clutter, and it is costing you more than you know. Not just in terms of peace, though the cost to peace is enormous, but in terms of energy, creativity, decision-making, relationships, and the basic capacity to be present in your own life. When your mind is full of unprocessed thoughts, unresolved feelings, unexamined beliefs, and unnecessary noise, there is simply less room for everything else. Less room for clarity, less room for focus, less room for joy, less room for the kind of deep, grounded presence that makes life feel meaningful. Think of it this way. A river that is clogged with debris does not flow well. The water is still there. The current is still there. The potential for movement is still there. But the blockage slows everything down. It creates turbulence where there could be stillness. It creates confusion where there could be direction. The solution is not to add more water. The solution is to remove what is blocking the flow. This audiobook is about removing what is blocking the flow of your mind. It is not a quick fix. It is not a promise of effortless transformation. It is not a collection of inspirational phrases designed to make you feel momentarily better before the familiar heaviness returns. It is an invitation to look honestly at the contents of your mind, the things you carry, the patterns you repeat, the noise you have learned to live with, and to begin, deliberately, and with great compassion for yourself, the process of letting go, not forcing, not suppressing, not pretending the difficult things do not exist, but genuinely, thoughtfully releasing what no longer serves you, creating space, making room, allowing the mind to settle into something cleaner, lighter, and more alive. Because here is what I know to be true. The mind was never meant to carry everything forever. Some thoughts were never meant to stay. Some worries were never meant to take up permanent residence. Some burdens were given to you by circumstances or by other people, and they do not actually belong to you at all. And the moment you begin to recognize this, the moment you start to distinguish between what your mind genuinely needs to hold and what it has simply been hoarding out of habit, something begins to shift. It starts quietly, almost imperceptibly, a small sense of relief, a breath that goes a little deeper, a moment of stillness that lasts a little longer. But these small moments compound, the way that any good habit compounds. And over time, the mind that once felt like a crowded, noisy, exhausting place begins to open into something you almost forgot was possible. A mind that is clear, a mind that is focused, a mind that is at peace. Let us begin. To understand why the mind becomes so cluttered, we first need to understand where the clutter comes from. Because mental noise does not appear from nowhere. It is generated by specific sources, specific habits, inputs, patterns, and environments that most people encounter every single day without realizing the cumulative toll they take. The first, and perhaps most pervasive source of mental toxicity is overthinking. Overthinking is one of the most misunderstood mental habits of our time. People often speak about it as though it were a productivity strategy that simply went a little too far. As though thinking more deeply and more thoroughly about things is always good, and overthinking is just the slightly excessive version of a basically healthy behavior. But that is not quite right. Overthinking is not deep thinking. Overthinking is a pattern in which the mind engages with a problem, concern, or scenario not to resolve it but to rehearse it, over and over, from every possible angle, exploring every possible outcome, rehearsing every possible response, anticipating every possible failure. The mind does this because it believes, on some level, that if it thinks long enough and hard enough, it will finally arrive at certainty, at safety, at a guarantee that things will turn out the way they need to turn out. But certainty never comes, because life does not offer certainty, and so the mind keeps going, keeps turning the problem over and over like a stone in its hands, looking for an edge it has not yet examined, a detail it may have missed, a scenario it has not yet prepared for. This cycle consumes enormous mental energy, not because the thinking is complex or sophisticated. In fact, much of what passes for overthinking is remarkably repetitive. The same thoughts, the same fears, the same worst-case scenarios, revisited again and again with only slight variations. It consumes energy because the mind is always running, always processing, always on. And here is the particular cruelty of overthinking. It rarely leads to better decisions. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently shown that for most decisions, especially complex ones involving uncertainty, a period of focused analysis followed by genuine mental rest produces better outcomes than prolonged deliberation. The mind needs space to process. It needs quiet to integrate, and overthinking denies it both. The second major source of mental clutter is comparison. We live in an age of extraordinary visibility. Through social media, through professional networks, through the constant stream of curated images and stories and achievements that populate our digital world, we have unprecedented access to information about how other people are living their lives. And this visibility, which sounds like it should be enriching, has instead become one of the most corrosive forces in modern mental life. The problem is not comparison itself. Some degree of social comparison is natural and even useful. It gives us context. It helps us calibrate our goals. It connects us to standards and communities that shape our aspirations. The problem is the kind of comparison that the modern world almost exclusively offers, which is one-sided, selective, and systematically biased toward showing us what we do not have. When you scroll through your phone and see someone else's highlight reel, the promotion, the vacation, the perfect family photo, the milestone, the achievement, your brain does not process this as a curated performance. It processes it as evidence of what other people's lives look like, evidence of where you stand in relation to them, evidence, far too often, that you are somehow behind, somehow less, somehow not quite measuring up to an invisible standard that was never actually defined or agreed upon. And this pattern, the constant, often unconscious measuring of your life against a carefully selected collection of other people's best moments, creates a specific kind of mental drain, a persistent, low-grade sense of inadequacy, a restlessness that cannot quite be satisfied because the goalposts are always moving, a heaviness that has nothing to do with anything real in your actual life and everything to do with a story your mind has been quietly telling you about where you should be. The third source of mental toxicity is information overload, and it deserves particular attention because it is so deeply woven into the fabric of contemporary life that most people have simply stopped noticing it. Consider what a single ordinary day involves. You wake up and check your phone before your feet hit the floor. You scroll through news, notifications, messages, updates, opinions, warnings. You listen to something in the shower. You consume content over breakfast. During your commute, you plug your ears with more sound, more information, more stimulation. Throughout your workday, you manage multiple streams of communication simultaneously: email, messaging apps, video calls, status updates. During lunch, you check in with social media. In the evening, you watch television or scroll or listen to podcasts until it is time to sleep. And then, often, you check your phone one more time before closing your eyes. This is the standard modern rhythm. It is so common that it barely registers as unusual. But consider what it means for the mind. The mind was not designed for this volume of input. It evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in environments where information was sparse, local, and almost always directly relevant to immediate survival. The idea that a human brain should healthfully process the equivalent of multiple newspapers, dozens of social interactions, several hours of audio content, and a constant stream of notifications every single day is not based in any understanding of how the mind actually works. What happens when the mind is continuously flooded with more information than it can meaningfully process is not that the information is simply discarded. Instead, much of it accumulates as background noise, as a kind of mental static that hums beneath the surface of conscious thought, making it harder to focus, harder to be present, harder to access the quieter, deeper layers of awareness where insight, creativity, and genuine peace actually live. And then, there is the fourth source of mental toxicity that does not always get the attention it deserves. Negative environments. The people, places, conversations, and energies that we allow into our daily lives. The mind does not exist in isolation. It is profoundly permeable, sensitive to the emotional tone of its surroundings, shaped by the quality of its inputs. If you spend a significant portion of your time around people who are chronically anxious, critical, negative, or draining, or in environments that are chaotic, hostile, or joyless, your mind absorbs that quality over time, not because you are weak, but because human beings are profoundly social creatures whose nervous systems are literally wired to attune to the emotional states of those around them. The cumulative effect of chronically negative environments is a kind of emotional residue, a background tension that you carry with you, even after you have left the physical environment. A heightened vigilance, a bracing, a readiness for things to go wrong that never quite relaxes, even when circumstances are actually fine. None of these sources of mental toxicity announces itself dramatically. Overthinking arrives as diligence. Comparison arrives as motivation. Information overload arrives as staying informed. Negative environments arrive as simply the circumstances of your life. They are quiet, gradual, almost invisible in their accumulation, but together they create a mind that is perpetually overloaded, perpetually reactive, perpetually tired. And here is what is so important to understand. This tiredness is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that you are not strong enough, not resilient enough, not capable enough. It is the natural, predictable consequence of a mind that has been carrying more than it was ever designed to carry, for longer than it was ever meant to carry it. The first step toward relief is simply understanding this. You are not broken. You are overloaded, and overloaded systems, in every domain of life, can be relieved through the right kind of reduction. Understanding where mental clutter comes from is one thing, but there is a question that follows naturally, and that is often even harder to answer. If all of this mental noise is making us tired, anxious, and less effective, why do we hold on to it? Why does the mind not simply let go of what is no longer serving it? This is one of the most important questions in all of psychology, because the answer reveals something essential about the nature of the mind and the process of genuine change. The first reason the mind holds on is emotional attachment. Thoughts and feelings, even painful ones, become familiar. And familiarity creates a kind of comfort, even when the familiar thing is causing harm. The worry you have carried about your financial situation for the past 5 years is exhausting, yes. But it is also known. It is yours. You have learned to navigate around it. You know where it lives in your mind and how it behaves. The idea of releasing it, of simply no longer being the person who worries about this particular thing, is stranger and more disorienting than it might initially seem. There is also a paradoxical function that certain kinds of negative thinking serve. For some people, worry feels like a form of control. If I worry enough about the bad thing, perhaps I can prevent it. If I run through every possible catastrophe in my mind, perhaps I will be ready when one arrives. If I never allow myself to fully relax, perhaps I am protecting myself from being caught off guard. This is not a conscious strategy. It is a learned pattern, usually developed in response to real experiences of uncertainty or threat. The mind learned, somewhere along the way, that vigilance equals safety, and so it maintains that vigilance even in situations where the threat has long since passed, and where vigilance is no longer actually protecting anything. The second reason the mind holds on is fear. Not just fear of the unknown, though that plays a significant role, but a more specific fear of what happens in the space that is created when mental clutter is removed. Because mental clutter, for all its costs, serves a function. It keeps the mind busy. And a busy mind does not have to feel certain things. It does not have to sit with grief. It does not have to confront loneliness. It does not have to face the questions that arise when the noise quiets down. Questions like, am I living the life I actually want to be living? Am I being honest with myself about what I need? What do I actually believe? Beneath all the noise and business and distraction, these questions can feel threatening, and so the mind, which is extraordinarily good at protecting us from discomfort, fills itself with other things, with tasks and concerns and distractions and worries, anything to avoid the particular vulnerability of actual stillness. This is why meditation is so hard for so many people when they first try it, not because they cannot sit still, but because sitting still forces them to be present with whatever is actually there, and whatever is actually there has not been looked at in a long time. The third reason the mind holds on is cognitive inertia. The brain is an organ of remarkable efficiency. It creates patterns, habits, and shortcuts precisely to avoid the energy cost of processing everything from scratch each time. Thoughts that have been thought thousands of times become grooves, literal neural pathways that the mind slides into with almost no effort, simply because they are the most established routes available. This is enormously useful in many contexts. Cognitive habits allow us to drive without consciously thinking about every movement, to recognize faces without analyzing features one by one, to use language without consulting a grammar manual. The brain's tendency toward pattern is one of its greatest strengths. But it also means that mental habits, including harmful ones, become progressively easier to fall into over time. The habit of negative self-talk, the habit of catastrophic thinking, the habit of rumination, the habit of comparing yourself unfavorably to others. These are not character defects. They are grooves that the mind has worn smooth through repetition. And because they are familiar, because they require almost no conscious effort to follow, they persist long after the circumstances that initially created them have changed. Changing these patterns requires something that the brain, by its nature, is designed to resist. It requires effort. Deliberate, sustained, often uncomfortable effort. Not brutal effort. Not the kind of white-knuckled willpower that exhausts itself in days, but the quiet, patient, consistent effort of choosing differently, again and again, until a new groove begins to form. The fourth reason the mind holds on is perhaps the most subtle and the most profound. Identity. Over time, we tend to become our thoughts in a way that makes those thoughts feel inseparable from who we are. The person who describes themselves as a worrier is not just describing a habit. They are describing something they understand as a fundamental part of their personality. The person who says, "I have always been anxious," or "I have always been someone who overthinks," is not just reporting a behavioral pattern. They are expressing something that feels like a core truth about their nature. And when something feels like a core truth about your nature, the prospect of releasing it becomes not just challenging, but almost existentially threatening. Because who would you be without the worry? Who would you be without the resentment you have been carrying for the last decade? Who would you be without the self-criticism that has been such a constant companion? These are questions that take courage to sit with. Because the honest answer is, you would still be you, fully, genuinely, and more peacefully you. But the mind, which is not accustomed to that kind of openness, tends to fill the prospect of that question with alarm rather than curiosity. Understanding all of this, understanding why the mind holds on even to what hurts it, is not an exercise in self-condemnation. It is an exercise in self-compassion. Because when you understand that your mental habits are the mind doing what minds do, seeking familiarity, avoiding discomfort, following established pathways, you stop taking them so personally. You stop treating them as evidence of failure, and you begin to see them for what they are: patterns. Patterns that were formed for reasons that once made sense. Patterns that can, with patience and gentleness and the right tools, be changed. This insight alone is a form of freedom, not the whole journey, but the beginning of it. I want to tell you a story now, because sometimes a story reaches the places that explanation cannot quite touch. Imagine a woman named Maya. She is 34 years old, and she is, by almost any external measure, doing well. She has a career that pays well, and that she is good at. She has a small apartment in a city she moved to 6 years ago, and that she mostly likes. She has friends, not as many as she once had, but people she genuinely cares about. She has a relationship that is fine, mostly fine, though there are conversations she and her partner keep almost having, and then pulling back from, like reaching toward something too hot and withdrawing before you can be burned. Maya does not feel like she is in crisis. She would tell you that herself, probably with a slightly nervous laugh. She knows people who are in crisis, real crisis, and she is aware enough of her own relative privilege to feel guilty when she considers the low-grade unhappiness that colors most of her days. She is fine, she tells people. Things are fine. But here is what Maya does not say, what she perhaps does not even fully allow herself to think. She is exhausted in a way she cannot explain. She sleeps 7 hours most nights and wakes up feeling like she has been working all through the darkness. She goes through the morning routine, coffee, shower, news, commute, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done these things so many times that her body handles them automatically, while her mind is somewhere else entirely. Usually, her mind is already at work, already reviewing the email she has to write, the conversation she has to have, the deadline she is slightly behind on. Sometimes her mind is still in yesterday, replaying a comment her colleague made in the meeting and wondering what exactly was meant by it. Sometimes her mind is in the future, months from now, calculating whether she will have saved enough, whether the relationship will still be fine, whether this is actually the life she wanted, or whether she got here by a series of small decisions that made sense individually and only became troubling in their accumulation. Maya's mind is never quiet. She realized this one evening when her partner had gone to bed early, and she found herself sitting on the couch in unusual silence. No television, no phone in her hand, and the silence felt so unfamiliar that she almost felt afraid of it. Like there was something lurking in it that she had been keeping at bay with sound. She turned the television back on. She told herself she just wanted to watch something. But she barely registered what was on the screen, because her mind was already moving again, circling the familiar territories of worry and regret and uncertainty with the thoroughness of a security guard checking the perimeter. She had been like this, she thinks, for years, maybe a decade. It is hard to say exactly when the quietness left. Maybe it was the period in her late 20s when her career was genuinely uncertain, and she had learned to stay vigilant, to always be prepared, because the ground kept shifting. Maybe it was the relationship before this one, the difficult one, the one that had involved a particular kind of emotional unpredictability that had taught her nervous system that relaxing was a luxury she could not afford. Maybe it had started even earlier, in a childhood where love sometimes felt conditional and attention had to be earned, and she had learned very young that it was better to think ahead, to anticipate, to be prepared, because the world could change without warning, and the best thing you could do was stay alert. She does not know when it started, but she knows that it is there, this constant inner machinery, this mind that will not rest. And what Maya does not yet know, what she will begin to discover in the months that follow, a conversation she has not yet had, a book she has not yet read, a quiet Tuesday morning when something finally breaks open, is that the exhaustion she carries is not the exhaustion of someone doing too much. It is the exhaustion of someone carrying too much, because inside Maya's mind, unsorted and unexamined, is an enormous collection of things that have never been properly attended to. There are worries that arrived years ago and were never resolved, just filed away in some corner of consciousness, where they continued to draw energy like appliances left on standby. There is the grief she never properly let herself feel about her mother's declining health, which she manages by being very organized and very practical, and very much in problem-solving mode whenever the subject arises. Because if she goes into the feeling, rather than the management of it, she is not sure she will be able to come back. There is the version of herself she was supposed to become, the version she had imagined at 22, full of specific ambitions and a particular picture of what a meaningful life would look like, and the quiet, persistent dissonance between that version and the life she is actually living. Not a dramatic dissonance, not a failure, exactly. Just a gap she has never quite let herself acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require deciding what to do about it, and she is not sure she has the energy for that. There is resentment, complicated, layered, not entirely comfortable to admit, toward a colleague who was promoted over her 2 years ago in a process she did not think was fair, and which she has never really spoken about to anyone in any depth, and which still surfaces at odd moments with a soreness that surprises her. There is the body of comparison that she carries like a stone in her pocket, the ongoing, involuntary measuring of herself against women she knows or follows, or has read about, who seem to be moving through the world with more ease, more confidence, more achievement, more clarity of purpose than she feels she has. She knows, intellectually, that what she sees is curated. She knows this the way you know that the moon is 238,000 miles away, as a fact that does not change the way the moon looks. There is the information she consumes every day. The news cycle, the social feeds, the think pieces, the podcasts, the newsletters she subscribed to with intention and reads with half a brain while doing something else, that fills every quiet moment with content, but leaves her feeling simultaneously overstimulated and somehow empty. And there is the conversation she and her partner keep almost having and pulling back from, about the future, about what they both actually want, about whether what they have is what they both need. It sits between them like an object on a table that neither of them has picked up in months. None of these things, on its own, would be enough to explain the weight Maya carries, but together, unprocessed, unexamined, held simultaneously in a mind that was never meant to hold all of them at once without ever setting any of them down. They create something that is genuinely debilitating, not visibly. Maya functions. She shows up, she does the work, she texts back, she smiles at the right moments, but inside, there is a woman who is so tired of carrying things that she sometimes, in the darkest private moments, dreams not of a different life, but simply of a different mind, one that would let her rest. And what Maya needs, what most of us need in our own versions of her story, is not more strength, not more discipline, not more willpower to force the mind into silence. What she needs is permission. Permission to look honestly at what she is carrying, to sort through it with compassion rather than judgment, to identify what genuinely needs attention and what can be released, to stop managing the weight and start actually setting some of it down. Maya's story is not unusual. In fact, in its broad outlines, it is remarkably common. The details differ, the specific worries, the particular resentments, the individual circumstances, but the pattern, the overloaded mind, the persistent exhaustion, the sense of carrying something you cannot quite name, is one that millions of people recognize in themselves, which is why what happens next in Maya's story matters. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it offers what is actually possible when someone decides to begin. Let us turn now to one of the most transformative things you can do for your mental life. And it begins, perhaps counterintuitively, not with doing anything at all. It begins with watching. Releasing negative thought patterns requires, as its first step, the ability to observe your own thinking. This sounds simple. It is in practice one of the most challenging skills in the human repertoire, because we are so thoroughly inside our thoughts that most of the time we do not observe them. We simply are them. The thought arises, and we follow it. We believe it. We react to it. We allow it to shape our mood, our perception, our choices, without ever stopping to ask whether it is actually true, whether it is actually useful, or whether it is even ours in any meaningful sense, or whether it is a reflex, a habit, an inherited pattern that has simply been running on autopilot for years. The practice of stepping back and observing the mind is the foundation of what cognitive psychology calls metacognition, thinking about thinking. And it is a skill that has been understood across many cultures and many centuries as one of the most liberating things a human being can develop. Not because it gives you control over every thought. You cannot control what thoughts arise. Thoughts come unbidden, like weather, but you can choose, with practice, whether to believe them, follow them, feed them, or simply observe them and let them pass. The moment you can look at a thought and say, "There is that pattern again," rather than I am in crisis, something fundamentally shifts. The thought is the same, but your relationship to it is different. And that difference is everything. So what does this actually look like in practice? It begins with noticing. When you notice that your mind has slipped into a familiar negative groove. The catastrophizing about a health symptom, the looping replay of an argument, the wave of comparison after looking at your phone. Pause. Not to judge the thought, not to force it away, but simply to notice it, to name it, even silently. I am catastrophizing, I am ruminating, I am comparing. Naming creates distance, not avoidance, real, healthy distance. The kind of distance that allows you to see the thought as a thought rather than as reality. From that place of distance, a powerful question becomes available. Is this thought actually true? Not probably true, not intuitively true, actually, demonstrably true. And even if it has some truth to it, is it the whole truth? Is there information I am discounting? Perspectives I am ignoring? Possible outcomes I am not considering? This is the heart of what cognitive psychologists call reframing. Not pretending a bad situation is good. Not forcing yourself into toxic positivity. But expanding the story the mind is telling. Finding the parts that are missing. The possibilities that are not yet in view. The evidence that does not fit the narrative the mind has constructed. Alongside awareness and reframing, emotional regulation plays a crucial role in releasing negative patterns, because thoughts and feelings are intimately connected. Negative thought patterns do not float free of emotional content. They are almost always driven by underlying feelings that have not been adequately processed. The anxiety that feeds the catastrophizing, the grief that feeds the rumination, the shame that feeds the self-criticism, the loneliness that feeds the comparison. When you address only the thought without attending to the feeling beneath it, you are cutting the weed at the stem rather than the root. The thought recedes temporarily and then returns, because the feeling that was generating it has not been given what it actually needed. What does a feeling need? In most cases, something surprisingly simple: to be noticed, named, acknowledged without judgment, not fixed, not explained, not argued with, just held, briefly, and with genuine compassion in the light of awareness. There is a fundamental principle in psychology that what is suppressed persists. The feeling you push down does not go away. It goes underground, and it finds other ways to surface, as physical tension, as irritability, as compulsive behaviors, as the relentless mental noise of a mind that is working overtime to keep something contained. Releasing a feeling does not mean dramatizing it or drowning in it. It means allowing it to exist in your awareness long enough to be processed. To say, there is sadness here, there is fear here, there is anger here, and to hold those statements with the kind of steadiness that you might bring to holding a child who is upset. Not trying to make the crying stop, but simply being present with it until it naturally subsides. This combination, awareness, reframing, and emotional processing, does not produce instant quiet, but practiced consistently, it begins to change the texture of the mind. Thoughts that once hijacked entire days begin to be recognized sooner. Emotional patterns that once escalated quickly begin to be caught earlier. The mind begins to develop a new default posture, one of observation rather than reaction, one of curiosity rather than judgment, one of openness rather than defense. And in that openness, something begins to breathe again. If releasing negative thought patterns is about changing the quality of what happens inside the mind, then building mental boundaries is about protecting the quality of what is allowed to enter it. We live in a culture that has, for the most part, completely abandoned the concept of mental boundaries, the idea that you might deliberately and consciously choose what you expose your mind to, what information you consume, what conversations you engage with, what media you allow into your awareness, what energy you permit yourself to spend sustained amounts of time near, is often treated as a form of avoidance, or privilege, or willful ignorance of the world's complexity. But this framing fundamentally misunderstands what mental boundaries are and what they protect. A mental boundary is not a wall. It is not an insistence on a sanitized, unchallenging, perfectly comfortable experience of the world. It is a recognition that attention is finite, that mental energy is a resource, that the quality of what you consistently attend to shapes the quality of your thinking, your mood, and your life, and that you have more agency over this than you have perhaps been told. Think about it this way. You would not eat spoiled food because it was freely available and ignoring it would require effort. You understand, instinctively, that some things are harmful to the physical body regardless of how convenient they are to consume. Mental boundaries rest on the same logic. Some inputs are harmful to the mental and emotional system, not because they are challenging or uncomfortable, which is not the same as harmful, but because they consistently leave the mind in a more depleted, more agitated, more distorted state than before they were consumed. Chronic exposure to negative news without any corresponding sense of agency or meaning making is one example. This is different from being informed. Being informed means consuming information in ways that connect to understanding, to context, to action, or to community. Chronic negative news exposure means scrolling through disaster, outrage, and catastrophe without framework, without resolution, without any outlet for the heightened arousal that the mind naturally generates in response. This pattern, research has repeatedly shown, increases anxiety, reduces feelings of personal effectiveness, and creates a pervasive sense of threat that persists well beyond the moment of consumption. Social environments that are chronically critical, dismissive, or emotionally unsafe are another example. Some relationships, over time, leave us more contracted, more self-doubting, more anxious. Not because the other person is necessarily malicious, but because something in the dynamic, the patterns, the history, the energetics, consistently costs more than it replenishes. Recognizing this is not cynicism. It is self-knowledge, and acting on it, by spending less time in those environments, by changing the nature of the interactions, or by building other relationships that provide what the difficult ones cannot, is not abandonment. It is stewardship. Setting mental boundaries also means protecting something that modern life has almost entirely eroded: unscheduled time. Time that is not filled with information, productivity, social obligation, or entertainment. Time in which the mind is simply allowed to be. The value of this kind of time is not intuitive to the modern sensibility. We are trained to believe that idle minds are wasted minds, that productivity is virtue, that rest must be earned. But neuroscience is quite clear on this point. The brain is not idle when it is not engaged in directed tasks. It is engaged in what researchers call the default mode network, a constellation of brain regions that activates during rest and is responsible for things like memory consolidation, creative problem solving, self-reflection, and the integration of experience into meaning. In other words, Some of the most important cognitive work the brain does happens precisely in the moments when it is not being driven towards specific goals. When we fill every moment with content and stimulation, we deprive the brain of this essential processing time. We deprive it of the chance to integrate what it has experienced, to consolidate what it has learned, to connect disparate ideas into new insights, to rest deeply enough that it can return to directed attention, genuinely refreshed. One of the most powerful mental boundaries you can set is around the first and last 30 minutes of your day. These transitional periods, the movement from sleep to waking and from waking to sleep, are neurologically significant. They are when the mind is most susceptible to the tonal quality of what it encounters. Starting the day with a barrage of news and notifications sets a specific neurological register, vigilant, reactive, alert to threat, that colors everything that follows. Starting the day with quiet, with gradual presence, with the simple experience of being awake before being productive, sets a different register, one of openness and steadiness. Similarly, ending the day by marinating in screens and stimulation until the moment of sleep does not allow the brain to complete its natural deactivation sequence. The result is sleep that is biochemically and neurologically shallower than it should be, and a mind that arrives at morning already slightly behind. These are not complicated changes. They do not require dramatic lifestyle overhauls, but they are genuine acts of stewardship toward a mind that is doing its best with what it has been given. The practice of setting mental boundaries is, at its core, an act of profound self-respect. It says my attention is valuable, my mental health matters, what I consistently expose my mind to shapes who I become. And I am going to be thoughtful about that, not out of fear or avoidance, but out of care for the quality of my inner life. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from what we do, but from the mental overhead of maintaining the vast, complicated internal landscape that most of us carry without question. Think for a moment about all the things currently living in your mind's operating system. The tasks you have not finished, the conversations you owe someone, the decisions you have been delaying, the goals you said you had but have not touched in weeks, the self-improvement projects you started with genuine intention and then quietly abandoned but never officially let go of. So they sit somewhere in the background of your awareness, generating a faint but persistent hum of guilt. The plans that were never quite completed, the ideas that were never quite developed, the promises you made to yourself that you are still technically holding. Psychologists call these open loops, and they are remarkably costly. Research on this phenomenon, often linked to what is called the Zeigarnik effect, named for psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who discovered that incomplete tasks tend to occupy more mental space than completed ones, suggests that the mind expends ongoing background energy on tasks and intentions that remain unresolved. They sit in working memory, drawing resources, keeping something on standby, waiting for completion that may never come. The solution is not to complete everything you have ever started. That is neither possible nor desirable. The solution is to close loops deliberately, to make conscious decisions about what you are actually going to do, what you are actually going to let go, and what you are going to do about what remains. The act of deciding, even deciding to not do something, releases the mental energy that was being spent on keeping the question open. This principle extends beyond tasks to the broader landscape of the inner world. Think about the beliefs you hold that you have never examined. Not your deeply considered values, but the automatic, often unconscious beliefs about yourself, other people, and the world that you absorbed from your environment, and that now run quietly in the background, shaping your perception without your awareness. Beliefs like "I have to earn love," "asking for help is a sign of weakness," "success is always one more achievement away," "other people's opinions of me are a reliable measure of my worth," "the world is fundamentally unsafe," "I am fundamentally not enough." These beliefs, unexamined, generate enormous mental noise. They create interpretations of experience that feel like facts. They drive emotional reactions that feel like reality rather than response. They close doors that were never actually locked. Simplifying your inner world means being willing to examine what you actually believe about yourself, about your capabilities, about what is possible, about what you deserve, and to question beliefs that have been generating noise without contributing anything of value to your life. Not because examining them is comfortable. It rarely is. But because the energy you are spending defending beliefs that do not serve you could be spent living with greater openness and possibility. Simplification also means being honest about what you actually want, as distinct from what you think you should want. What you have been trained to want, what looks good to others, or what you used to want, but have outgrown. Desire is one of the most clarifying forces in human psychology when it is allowed to be honest. But when it is constantly filtered through obligation, comparison, and the accumulated expectations of others, it becomes murky and confused. And a confused inner compass generates enormous mental noise. The endless second guessing, the inability to commit, the sense of moving without direction. Getting honest about what you actually want, not all at once, not through some dramatic revelation, but gradually. Through the practice of asking and listening and trusting what you hear, is one of the most powerful forms of mental decluttering available. Finally, simplifying the inner world involves developing a different relationship with uncertainty. One of the primary drivers of mental clutter is the mind's relentless attempt to resolve what cannot yet be resolved, to know what the future holds, to guarantee outcomes, to eliminate risk through sheer force of thought. But uncertainty is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition of being alive. No amount of planning, preparing, or worrying has ever successfully eliminated it. What it does eliminate, or at least significantly reduce, is the present moment experience of being here, in this actual moment, with what is actually available. Learning to be in the present with uncertainty, not by pretending it does not exist, but by recognizing that this moment, right now, is complete in itself, is a profound form of simplification, because the present moment, however it is, requires a fraction of the mental resources that the simultaneously managed past and future demand. To create space for clarity in the mind, you need to understand what clarity actually is and why it is so rare. Clarity is not the absence of complexity. Life is complex. Relationships are complex. Decisions often involve genuinely competing values and insufficient information. Clarity is not a state in which everything is simple and certain. Clarity is the condition in which you can see what is actually in front of you, in which your perception is not distorted by the accumulated noise of unprocessed emotion, habitual assumption, and mental overload, in which you can think, not react, but actually think, about what matters and what to do about it. Mindfulness, in its most stripped-down form, is the practice of creating this condition deliberately, not by going somewhere special or achieving some elevated state, but by doing something deceptively simple, paying full, deliberate attention to what is actually happening right now. The breath is the most common anchor for this practice, and for good reason. It is always present. It is always in the current moment. It is involuntary enough that you do not have to manage it, but voluntary enough that you can attend to it deliberately. When you pay attention to the breath, not controlling it, not judging it, not improving it, but simply noticing it, you are doing something profound. You are pulling the mind out of the abstraction of past and future and into the immediacy of now. And in the immediacy of now, the noise quiets. Not permanently. The mind will wander. This is not failure. It is the nature of the mind. The practice is not in maintaining perfect attention. It is in noticing when the mind has wandered and bringing it back again and again and again. This act of returning, of gently, without self-criticism, redirecting attention to the present, is the practice. And each time you do it, you are building a specific neural capacity, the capacity to observe your own mind without being completely captured by it. Journaling is another powerful tool for creating mental clarity, not the performed kind of journaling, the kind that tries to be beautiful or coherent, or that is written with an imagined future reader in mind, but the raw, honest, somewhat messy kind that is written purely for the purpose of getting what is inside your head onto a page. There is something clarifying that happens when the formless swirl of thought is forced into the linear structure of language. Thoughts that felt overwhelming in their vagueness often become more manageable when they are written out. Feelings that seemed enormous often reduce to something more workable when they are named and described. Patterns that were invisible in the flow of daily experience often become visible when there is a record of them. Journaling is, in this sense, a form of externalizing the mind, of giving yourself enough distance to actually see it. Reflection, genuine reflection, not the anxious kind but the slow, curious, generative kind, is another clarity-creating practice. Taking time, regularly, to step back from the momentum of daily life and ask a few honest questions. What is actually working in my life right now? What is actually not working? What am I avoiding that I know I need to address? What have I been grateful for recently? What do I genuinely need more of, and what do I need less of? These are not complicated questions, but they require something that most modern schedules actively prevent: uninterrupted time with your own mind, time that is not structured around productivity or social obligation, time that belongs to the work of self-understanding. Creating this space is not a luxury. It is a necessity for anyone who wants to live with genuine intentionality rather than simply reacting to whatever the day brings. Because if you never step back to see the shape of your life, you cannot make meaningful choices about its direction. You can only respond, and responding is exhausting in a way that choosing is not. The mind does not exist in isolation. It is continuously shaped by the environment in which it lives, by the habits that structure its days, by the relationships that form its emotional landscape, by the information it routinely consumes, and by the physical conditions in which it operates. Building a healthier mental environment means attending to all of these dimensions with the same care and intentionality that you might bring to designing a physical space in which you want to live well. Start with habits. Not because habits are the whole story. They are not. but because habits are the infrastructure through which most of our lives are actually lived. The vast majority of daily behavior is habitual, automated, running without conscious deliberation. And because this is so, the quality of your habits largely determines the quality of your mental life in ways that conscious effort alone cannot match. Sleep is the foundation. There is no mental health intervention more powerful, more consistently effective, or more broadly supported by research than good sleep. Sleep is not passive downtime for the brain. It is when the brain consolidates memory, processes emotional experiences, clears metabolic waste through the glymphatic system, and restores the neurological resources that support everything from attention and decision making to emotional regulation and creative thinking. Chronic sleep deprivation is not just tiredness. It is a systematic impairment of almost every cognitive and emotional function. Movement is another non-negotiable foundation. Regular physical activity is one of the most reliably effective interventions for anxiety, depression, stress, and cognitive function. Not because it is a distraction from mental difficulty, though that is sometimes part of it, but because it directly changes the brain's chemistry and structure in ways that support mental well-being. Exercise increases the availability of neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. It stimulates the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth of new neurons and the health of existing ones. It reduces cortisol levels. It interrupts rumination by demanding physical presence. It is, in a very real sense, one of the most reliable mental hygiene practices available. Nutrition matters too, though perhaps less dramatically than the wellness industry sometimes suggests. The brain is a metabolic organ. Its function is influenced by blood sugar stability, hydration, and the availability of nutrients that support neurotransmitter production. Chronic poor nutrition does not just affect the body. It affects cognition, mood, and resilience in ways that compound over time. Beyond these physical foundations, the relational environment is enormously significant. We have already touched on the costs of chronically negative relationships, but it is worth speaking equally clearly about the value of genuinely nourishing ones. Human beings are deeply social. We need connection, real connection, the kind that involves genuine witnessing and genuine reciprocity, in ways that are not metaphorical but biological. Loneliness, isolation, and the absence of meaningful relationship are not just emotionally painful. They are physiologically stressful in ways that affect immune function, cardiovascular health, and cognitive performance. We are wired for belonging, building and maintaining relationships that genuinely nourish, that offer honest conversation, mutual support, shared laughter, and the particular kind of ease that comes from being seen and accepted, is not a social nicety. It is an act of mental health care. This does not mean surrounding yourself only with people who agree with you or who make you comfortable all the time. Challenge, difference, and honest friction are all part of healthy relationships, but the underlying quality, the sense that this relationship adds to my life, that this person sees me and I see them, that this connection is genuinely mutual, is what matters. The information diet is the final dimension of the mental environment that deserves attention. We have already discussed the costs of information overload, but building a healthier information environment is not just about reducing consumption. It is about being intentional about quality and context. This means prioritizing depth over breadth, one well-considered article that you actually read, and think about is more nourishing for the mind than 30 headlines scrolled and half absorbed. It means favoring information sources that offer context, nuance, and intellectual honesty over those that traffic in outrage, urgency, and simplification. It means being willing to ask about any information you routinely consume, whether it consistently leaves you more informed, more capable, and more at peace, or whether it consistently leaves you more anxious, more confused, and more depleted. A mind that is well slept, regularly moved, genuinely connected, and thoughtfully nourished exists in a fundamentally different condition from one that is deprived in these dimensions, not because it is free from difficulty. All minds encounter difficulty, but because it has the resources to meet difficulty with resilience rather than collapse. Now I want to return to Maya, because the story does not end with her sitting on the couch, afraid of the silence. Several months after that evening, something shifted. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but she found herself in a conversation with an old friend she had not spoken to in more than a year. A friend who had always been, as Maya thought of it, honest to the point of discomfort, and in the middle of what had begun as an ordinary catch up, the friend said something that landed differently than Maya had expected. She said, simply, "You sound like you are working very hard to be fine." Maya laughed first, the automatic social reflex. And then something else happened. The laugh became something different. Something that was not quite crying, but was close to it. And she sat with that for a moment, in the unusual silence that her friend was wise enough to hold, and she thought, yes. That is exactly it. I am working very hard to be fine. She did not tell her friend everything that night, but she told her enough. And something about the act of naming it, saying out loud, to someone who was genuinely listening, the contours of the exhaustion she had been managing so quietly for so long, released something. Not fixed it, not solved it, but released something. In the weeks that followed, Maya began to make small changes. Nothing dramatic. She did not quit her job. She did not end her relationship. She did not move to the country and start keeping bees. She simply began to pay attention in a different way. She started waking up 15 minutes earlier than she needed to. Not to be more productive, but to sit with her coffee in the quiet of the morning before the day required anything of her. She did not do this every day. Some mornings she was too tired or too rushed, and she did not bother. But the days she did it were noticeably different. There was a quality of groundedness to them that she gradually learned to recognize and to want. She began to journal, not beautifully, not coherently. She wrote things that were embarrassing to reread. She wrote things that were confused and circular, and sometimes frankly petty. But she wrote, and she noticed something. Thoughts that had felt enormous and shapeless inside her head became, on the page, more finite, more containable. Less like a storm and more like weather. She started to notice when she was comparing herself to others. Really notice it, in the moment, before the familiar sinking feeling had fully taken hold. And to ask the question she had not previously known to ask, compared to what? By whose measure? Toward what end? These questions did not always dissolve the comparison, but they created a pause, a beat of genuine inquiry between the stimulus and the reaction. She began to have the conversation she and her partner had been avoiding. It was uncomfortable. It was not one conversation but several, and some of them were hard in ways she had been afraid they would be. But something on the other side of those conversations felt different, more real. more present. Less like managing a situation and more like actually inhabiting her relationship. She let herself grieve about her mother, not all at once, and not in any structured way. But she let it surface sometimes, in the early mornings with her coffee, or in the car after a visit, and she did not immediately reach for the management response. She let herself feel it, and it was hard, and it did not last as long as she had feared, and on the other side of it, there was something that felt, surprisingly, like tenderness. She began to be more deliberate about her fun, not with rigid rules. She knew herself well enough to know that rigid rules invited rebellion, but with small, repeated choices. Not checking it first thing in the morning. Not having it next to her when she was eating. Not reaching for it when there was a moment of stillness that she could instead simply be present in. None of this was miraculous. None of it erased the complexity of her life or the genuine challenges she faced. But the sum of these small changes produced something that she had not expected. Not happiness, exactly. Though there were more moments of something like happiness than there had been before. It was more like spaciousness, like the feeling of taking off a backpack you did not realize you had been wearing and discovering that your shoulders could actually move. Maya did not reach some final destination. She is not, in any finished sense, done, but she began, and in the beginning, she discovered something that she will now tell anyone who asks. The heaviness was never fully hers. Some of it she had picked up without knowing. Some of it had been handed to her. Some of it she had been carrying out of habit, long after the original reason for carrying it had passed, and setting it down. Even some of it, even imperfectly, even gradually, changed not what her life looked like from the outside, but what it felt like from the inside. And that, she discovered, was what she had been looking for all along. We are approaching the end of our time together, and before we close, I want to offer something that is less about technique and more about truth. The mind, as we have explored together, is a remarkable and profoundly sensitive instrument. It registers everything. It feels everything. It holds everything it has ever experienced in some form, even when the conscious self has long since moved on. It is not a machine. It is not a tool to be optimized. It is the medium through which you experience your entire life. And like all sensitive instruments, it requires care. Regular, intentional, compassionate care. Not perfection. Not the absence of difficulty or noise or confusion. Those will come regardless. But the kind of care that says, I am going to pay attention to what I am holding. I am going to ask whether what I am carrying is actually mine to carry, and whether it is serving me, and whether the time has come to put some of it down. The mind was never meant to carry everything forever. Some thoughts were always meant to be passing. The ones that arose in a moment of stress and were never intended to become permanent residents. The catastrophic scenario that felt urgent when the anxiety was high and now, in a calmer moment, looks different. The worry that has been visiting for years without ever resolving into anything actionable. These thoughts served a purpose, perhaps. They asked to be noticed, but they were never meant to be homes. Some worries need to be questioned rather than obeyed. Not every fear that arises in the mind is wisdom. Some fears are old echoes, learned in contexts that no longer apply, maintained by habits of thought that have never been examined. The fear of asking for what you need, the fear of failure so pervasive that it prevents beginning. The fear of being seen, really seen, in your full imperfect complexity, that keeps you at a safe and lonely distance from genuine connection. These fears ask to be questioned, gently, curiously, without cruelty, but honestly. Is this still true? Is this still mine? Does this still need to be here? Some burdens need to be put down. The resentment that you have been carrying for someone who may not even remember what they did. The version of yourself you have been trying to protect that you have long since outgrown. The grief that you have been managing rather than feeling. The relationship you have been maintaining out of obligation rather than genuine connection. The image of what your life was supposed to look like by now. These burdens were given to you by circumstance, by other people, by a younger and less experienced version of yourself who was doing the best they could. They do not all have to be carried forever, and in the moment you create space inside your mind, not by forcing it, not by suppressing what is there, but by genuinely, thoughtfully releasing what no longer belongs. Something opens. Clarity becomes available. Not perfect clarity. Not the absence of all confusion. But the kind of clarity that allows you to see your life as it actually is, rather than through the fog of accumulated noise. The kind that allows genuine decisions, made from genuine values, rather than reflexive reactions to a mind too overloaded to think straight. Focus becomes available, not the forced, grinding focus of a mind trying to concentrate despite enormous internal resistance, but the natural, effortless focus that arises when the mind is not simultaneously managing 15 other things. When it is actually present, when it is given one thing to attend to, and allowed to attend to it fully, gratitude becomes available. Not the performed gratitude of a gratitude journal filled in dutifully each morning, though that practice, done honestly, is not without value, but the natural, spontaneous recognition of what is genuinely good in your life, that arises when the mind is not too busy, too anxious, too distorted by comparison and worry to notice it. There is an enormous amount of goodness in most lives that goes completely unregistered because the mind is too cluttered to see it clearly, and peace. Not the peace of a life without challenge or difficulty, not the peace that depends on circumstances being just right, but the peace that is available in the midst of an ordinary, complex, imperfect life. When the mind is clear enough to be present in it, when it is not weighted down by unnecessary burdens, when it can simply be here, in this moment, with what is actually available. This is what mental clarity ultimately offers, not a different life, your life, but experienced more fully, more honestly, and with far greater freedom than is possible when the mind is perpetually overwhelmed. The work we have done together in these pages is only a beginning. You will have days when the mental clutter feels as thick as ever, when the old patterns reassert themselves with their familiar force, when the noise returns and the peace feels far away. This is not failure. It is the nature of any genuine process of growth. The path is not a straight line, it is a spiral, returning to the same places again and again, but each time from a slightly higher vantage point, with slightly greater understanding and slightly greater ease. What matters is not that you have permanently arrived somewhere. What matters is that you are willing to keep choosing, to keep paying attention, to keep asking with honesty and without cruelty. What am I carrying that does not belong to me? What can I release today? What would it feel like if my mind were just a little lighter than it was yesterday? Because sometimes the greatest transformation is not about adding more. More knowledge, more discipline, more effort, more achievement. Sometimes the greatest transformation is about letting go of what no longer belongs. And in that letting go, in that quiet, brave, patient act of releasing, something essential is restored, not something new, something original, something that was there before the weight accumulated, before the noise began, before the world taught you to fill every silence with something to be afraid of, the clarity that has been waiting beneath the clutter all along, the peace that is, and always has been, your most natural state. Take a breath now, a real one, slow, full, deliberate, and notice that for just this moment, the mind is a little quieter. Let that be enough for today.